The next team is our client was Bike New York. The group will explain a little more about them. What I found fun is they were in the news a lot this semester. I don't know if you guys felt that way as well. They had a lawsuit with the city over tried to take away their funding for security measures for their big event, which took place yesterday. Yesterday was the Bike New York Bike-a-thon, right? Or is that what it's called? Anyway, so let me turn it over to Josh.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Stuart. My name is Josh Harkey. I'm representing the Bike New York workshop team here. We spent about a few weeks in the beginning of our time starting to figure out what the nature of our relationship with Bike New York was going to be for the course of this semester, and I'll be getting into some of the details of that as we go along in our presentation. First, I want to introduce our team. I'm up here alone. That's me, Josh, at the top. But sitting here is Maud, Caitlin, Chloe, and unfortunately she couldn't make it today, but Mary is also a part of our team. You'll see next to our names here some numbers that you've probably already figured out that they're not our ages. In fact, part of the reason that we were attracted to the Bike New York project was that two of our members, myself included, did not learn to bike until the last few years. So the numbers next to our names are the ages we were when we learned to ride a bike. Our client that we've already been talking about is Bike New York. Bike New York is a nonprofit organization that runs in New York City. The primary focus of their operation are educational classes that are offered for free to anybody that is interested in signing up for them. The most popular of the classes is a Learn to Ride class for adults. And in the last 2 years alone, over 17,000 New York City residents signed up for these free classes. Now, when we began talking with Bike New York about what the nature of our project was going to be, they had some general objectives that they were hoping to gain some insight into over the course of our time with them. And those main questions were the following: why students don't continue after the beginner classes. So as I was mentioning, the most popular class that Bike New York offers is a Learn to Ride class for adults. They also offer a class which is what they have defined as a follow-up to that class. It's what they call Bike Basics, and the idea is that once you've taken Learn to Ride, by the time you finish that class, you are in a position to at least be able to stay steady on a bike and go in a straight line. And Bike Basics is designed to actually help you navigate on a bike and be able to use your brakes to actually be able to ride throughout New York City. So most students take those classes, but don't take any of the more advanced classes that Bike New York offers, and Bike New York is trying to understand why that is the case. In addition, going beyond just the classes themselves, Bike New York is interested in just identifying what barriers residents of New York face in biking more throughout New York City, and how they might be able to attract more people to be able to overcome those barriers. Another thing that Bike New York has noticed is that the vast majority of their students are women, and they're trying to understand why there is this discrepancy for their classes. Again, Bike New York does not make a whole lot of money. Most of their profits come from a 5-borough bike tour that Stuart was just mentioning that happened yesterday for this year. And there's an entrance fee for participants in that bike tour, and the idea is that it is a tour to raise awareness about biking as a means of transportation, but in addition, the entrance fee for the participants goes to being able to pay for instructors and volunteers to facilitate these classes that Bike New York runs. So given that, Bike New York is also looking for other ways to encourage biking in New York in an affordable manner. And finally, Bike New York wants to be able to assess the success of their own classes, and so in that sense, they want to be able to get feedback from the participants of their classes and be able to determine a kind of change in behavior following one of their classes. In all of this sense, we came to the conclusion that the best means of being able to address these questions that Bike New York had for us were to be able to implement surveys that participants taking the Bike New York classes would fill out at different times. So right now, Bike New York already has a brief intro survey that when you go online to their website to participate in one of their classes, you fill out a few pieces of information. It's very basic demographic information, and that's not much more than that. So what we wanted to do is to be able to flesh out that intro survey, be able to start addressing some of these questions that Bike New York had, and then in addition to that, in order to be able to see the change in behavior from before the student took the class to, say, a year after, and being able to try to map in some way how effective the class was at being able to really improve a person's bike skills and whether they really are biking more throughout New York. So the idea is the intro and exit surveys mirror each other in the content quite a bit, and that's so that we're able to look how a person answered a question before they took the class and how they answered it 1 year later when the exit survey is administered. So we spent our time being able to come up with the content of what these surveys were going to have, and we wanted to be able to get some feedback from participants that have already taken the Bike New York classes. So what we did is we created a pilot survey, which effectively has the same content as the intro and exit surveys, but since we don't have the ability to, or the time rather, for the course of our semester, to be able to both ask a participant what they were up to before they took the class and then a year later, we essentially condensed that down into one survey. So what we did is we sent the pilot survey to participants that took Bike New York classes last year, and that was approximately 1,000 Learn to Ride participants, about 400 or so that took this Bike Basics class that I mentioned earlier, and we did send them to a third class, which is a street skills class, which is one of these more advanced skills class that I was mentioning earlier, and the nature of that class is to be able to help students find their way around New York City with a little bit more comfort than they might have otherwise. But as I was mentioning, the first two classes, this Learn to Ride and the Bike Basics, are the most popular, so that was the sort of concentration of what kind of data we were getting from this. And I want to take the opportunity to mention that we spent a good deal of our time being able to put together these surveys in the interest of not producing something that was going to yield an answer that we just wanted to get from the surveys. And we had a surprising amount of difficulty in being able to come up with questions that did not lead on the participant in whatever manner we saw fit. And also to make sure that when you're taking the survey that it's not some complicated way of phrasing this. Often we had a way of focusing on jargon that maybe was a little bit more esoteric than, say, somebody that has just taken their first biking class ever. So I want to address the 5 different questions that Bike New York had for us through some of the data that we were able to collect. And what we're going to start with is why it is that students don't necessarily continue after the beginning classes that they have. So this chart here, you can see on the left are the different questions that, the different responses that students could fill out for why they chose not to go on to take another class. And this middle column here, LTR is just an acronym for Learn to Ride, and BB is Bike Basics, just so you'll see that throughout the course of the rest of the results here. And the biggest responses were that classes were full, or that they weren't offered at an inconvenient place or time. And then we also heard from a number of participants that they just preferred to practice on their own after they got the basics down. So these were sort of the biggest concerns that we had from students, which typically had to do with the actual logistics of the classes that Bike New York was providing for them. Next were what these common barriers are to people in New York City to being able to bike more. And we found that above all else, there is just a sense that there's a great discomfort of riding near vehicles in New York City, and that even above all that the idea of riding a bike is something that is maybe upsetting to some people within New York City, just given the kind of busy lifestyle that there is. And I wanted to include the other responses here just so we can get a sense of the kind of perspective that it is a minority of people, but there are certain logistics to riding in New York City that make it difficult. That is where there is space to be able to keep your bike, and a sort of sense of bike infrastructure within New York being potentially somewhat limited. Next, we talked about the behavioral change for students before they took the classes and 1 year later. So here we have what students responded as their comfort level of different areas that they could ride in before they took the class and after they took the class. And if you look, the purple bars are the percentage of students that said they were comfortable riding in those areas 1 year after taking the class. And you can see that overall there is an increase in comfort level for the bike riders. So there's a sense of that the Bike New York classes are actually effective in being able to change the behavior of the students that participate in them. Now, to look to why it is that more women than men enroll in the classes is maybe a little bit more complex of an issue at hand. And one of our hypotheses about why it is that more women than men are taking the classes is that more women than men were responding that fear and just general discomfort of riding in New York City were the things that were stopping them from biking more. So our theory is that if women are less comfortable riding in New York City, they'll have greater incentive to enroll in a class that teaches them to be able to ride or improve their skills. And in this sense, they'll be able to maybe overcome this general fear that they have of riding in the classes. Finally, Bike New York wanted to be able to address what are some affordable ways of encouraging biking throughout New York. We asked our survey participants to list whether or not they were interested in group rides. This is something that we were getting a notion from after talking to various volunteers for the various classes that Bike New York offers, and we got some feedback from them that there's some interest in these group rides. And so approximately 80% of the students that participated in the survey responded that they'd be interested in participating in some group rides as a way to encourage them to bike more throughout New York City. So we're hoping that Bike New York might be able to facilitate group rides for beginning riders, since there are a number of group ride organizations that are sort of informal and operate through various blogs and websites that organize group rides for particular kinds of communities within New York City, but none focuses specifically on riders that are new to the game here. So this is one of the ways that we think Bike New York might be able to encourage biking in the city. Now, I already was addressing on the group rides here, but we should also talk about moving forward, being able to improve the surveys that we first administered. We received a good deal of feedback from the various participants about the content of our surveys, and in addition, even if it wasn't explicit advice of theirs about how to improve the survey, we had some difficulties in that we had certain questions that weren't required for students to fill out, and as a result, we didn't get quite as much information as we want. So there are various changes that we'll be making to the surveys in being able to move forward. And in addition, as I was mentioning earlier, there was a great sense from the participants that they wished that Bike New York was able to offer classes more frequently or in different locations around the city that were more accessible for them. So one of our recommendations to Bike New York is to hopefully be able to use the resources that they have to offer more classes and in different locations so that they're able to reach more of New York City in that sense. And finally, one point I wanted to touch on before we wrap up here is that most of the Bike New York participants are coming from areas that have a good deal of bike infrastructure in New York City. You can look at this map here. The areas that are highlighted in red designate higher concentrations of Bike New York participants in those zip code regions throughout New York City. And the blue lines on the map, I can't tell if they're hard to see from where you are, but those indicate bike lanes in New York City. And although it's not a perfect correlation, there are a great deal of bike lanes from the areas specifically where the Bike New York participants are coming from. And on the contrary, there aren't a whole lot of Bike New York participants coming from areas that don't have bike lanes. So the fact that participants didn't mention bike lanes as a hindrance to their being able to bike more in New York City is not very surprising, considering they're coming from areas that have quite a few of them. Now, if Bike New York is able to encourage New York City to be able to create infrastructure in areas that don't currently have a great deal of it, it may be able to also encourage more biking interest in those regions as well. So this is sort of our final recommendation to Bike New York, and being able to use this information, this correlation here of participation in their classes and the infrastructure in the city to be able to encourage the city to be able to act on this to also at the same time encourage more biking in New York. Finally, I just wanted to thank Professor Gaffin and our TA, Maddie Cohen, for being able to guide us throughout this process, and of course the team at Bike New York. Thanks. If there's any questions, happy to take them, and I can invite the rest of my team up to.
Okay, I have a question, a couple questions. One, did you have age information in your demographics?
Age information?
Yeah.
We did not collect age information in the preliminary survey.
Because your gender distinction could also be masking an age distinction if you don't have that. The second thing, did you talk at all about doing focus groups instead of surveys? Because you might get more of the sort of nuanced and detailed information that way.
Absolutely. So a lot of the information that is represented in this presentation is some of the quantitative data that we were trying to collect throughout the survey process. We also did ask for a good deal of some qualitative information from the participants whenever they were interested in offering them. And the reason we didn't focus specifically on having a focus group per se is as we were developing the survey, we also went to visit some of the classes that Bike New York was offering. And a lot of the anecdotes that we got from the participants there after just sort of chatting with them seemed to support a lot of the information that we were already choosing as assumptions in the survey. So we thought this was a way to be able to get to a broader audience and be able to have maybe a better representation just given the number of respondents.
I can say one thing too.
Yeah.
About the age question, we actually did note that in revising the intro and exit survey that we will be sending out, and we're asking for age from those participants in the future, so we can analyze that data as well.
You might want to also look at socioeconomic, because if your bike lanes are correlating with wealthier neighborhoods, then you may also not be getting a representative sample of the city, potential bike riders that way.
Right, so we actually did, we didn't explicitly ask for the participants' financial information, but what we did do is we mapped income brackets for the distribution. Here, I'll go back for a second. So we have all the students mapped through zip codes throughout New York City, and we looked at this against the general income bracket for that neighborhood, and we actually didn't find any correlation at all. Sort of surprisingly, actually, there was a great distribution of participants from various income brackets throughout the city. Yeah.
As a biker myself, I really don't like how bike not friendly the public transportations are. And have you ever looked at how bikers use public transportation with their bikes?
That wasn't really the nature of our survey, and given that a lot of the participants in these surveys are very new to biking, I think that their biking around the city is maybe not so much as something to commute, for example, and so I think that maybe that didn't come up as a result, but it obviously would be an interesting point to.
If I can add something, we did a little bit of research about the city's initiatives in terms of improving biking infrastructure, and actually Plan NYC is trying to, already there's the bike sharing program that's going to start soon, and which Bike New York is very excited about. But what we found out was actually that the interest the city has in improving bike infrastructure, for instance, places to store bikes or to log bikes in the streets, are actually designed to facilitate the use of public transportation. So, for instance, you'll see that a lot of the stands or a lot of the bike racks are located near subway stations, so that someone may bike to the subway station and leave his or her bike there and then use the subway. So actually the city and Bike New York have considered how public transportation and biking can go hand in hand.
I hate to say it, but biking for me, is a pet peeve of mine. It seems like there's an enormous amount of irresponsibility of bikers these days. Over the last few years, it's just been wildly irresponsible. And given that, I'd like to ask you if you have encouraged safe driving practices, and also have you looked into what Mayor Bloomberg is doing about these irregularities in biking practices, because it's really dangerous.
Sorry, by driving practices, do you mean
Bicycling,
vehicles or
safety? No, safety.
Okay,
Safety.
actually, Bike New York has a collaboration with the NYPD, I think, and they people who get fined for biking in a illegal manner have the choice of either paying the fine or attending a Bike New York class. Actually, so there is definitely an awareness as to, sorry.
I can say one thing too.
Yeah, go ahead.
In our initial meetings with Bike New York, they focused on the different elements in making biking more accessible to people, and two of them were enforcement, and another one was education. And they focus on education, educating the new bikers about how to bike and how to be safe. Enforcement isn't really there. They encourage it, but they're really focused on the education component of new bikers. But that's definitely something that they work with the city, obviously, through these programs. But it's just not their primary focus.
Might I add that the street skills classes actually has that in mind. The idea is that not only do the students get to bike in a safer manner, but they actually bike in accordance to the laws, like the city's laws.
What was the response rate for your survey?
It was a little over 10%.
You mentioned the City Bike program, and I was just curious what Bike New York's plans are for potentially integrating with that program or working with that program and collaborating.
Well, they are definitely in contact with them, and they have a relationship with them. They don't have anything very direct or any thing planned in the near future. They definitely encourage, they definitely organize their classes and their programs in accordance with the improving infrastructure in the city. And for instance, they're very excited about the bike share program because they believe that will actually draw more students to their classes. We definitely took some of this into account in our recommendations. So, for instance, the city is the Plan NYC actually emphasizes biking as a means for tourists to get around, and not only New York City residents. So, for instance, we also gave a recommendation to Bike New York in terms of maybe offering classes, not necessarily for learning how to bike, but maybe for tourists to get around New York City. The main obstacle to this is, again, resources. Bike New York doesn't really have the resources to offer more classes as of now, but we definitely made recommendations that they could potentially go over in the future when the resources are, maybe when they have more resources. And I also wanted to add one last thing. We were in contact with their PR department, so a lot of the stuff that we were doing was also of interest to them in terms of marketing. They wanted to use some of the information we gathered from the survey to promote their classes and also to maybe establish a better relationship with the city. The idea was that if they could go to the people they already know at Plan NYC and within the city administration and say, listen, these are the actual results of our classes, and this is the change that we've been affecting, that they could probably have more of a powerful, more power to the relationship, basically.
Sorry if you already said this, but are students required to bring their own bikes to the Learn to Ride? Or?
No. That's one of the main resource problems, actually. A lot of the instructors are volunteers. The reason why these classes are full is because they don't have any more bikes to hand out.
Just back on the tourism thing, has Bike NYC considered giving guided bike tours to tourists rather than giving them classes? If they don't know where to go.
As I've mentioned, for now they are pretty resource constrained. We definitely proposed many things like that. We think that it would be very beneficial to them to maybe expand a little bit into bike tours, bike group rides, as Josh mentioned. It doesn't seem like it's anything that they're going to be adopting anytime soon, but we made that recommendation.
And as Josh mentioned too, we spoke with several volunteers and instructors at the classes in order to craft the pilot surveys and the intro and exit surveys, and they were very enthusiastic about the work they're doing and the effect they're having. So part of our recommendations went along with the fact that they have so many passionate people willing to help out and possibly create those programs and those group rides, or at least facilitate their students meeting up and finding ways to bike in the city.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.